The gunshot that killed Jacob Matthews echoed through the canyon 6 years ago, and Deputy Marshal Daniel Garrett had been carrying the weight of that sound ever since. He stood on the wooden planks of Leadville's Main Street in the summer heat of 1882, watching dust devils dance between the buildings while miners streamed past him toward the silver operations that kept this Colorado town alive. At 32 years old, Daniel had learned to build walls around himself so thick that even the rowdiest Saturday nights in the saloons barely registered anymore. He kept order, enforced the law, and went home to an empty cabin where the silence had become his only companion. The stage from Denver arrived late that afternoon, wheels creaking as the driver pulled hard on the reins. Daniel barely glanced up from his position outside the marshal's office until he heard the commotion. A woman's voice rang out sharp and clear, cutting through the general noise of the street with an authority that made him turn his head. "I said no, and I meant it. Keep your hands to yourself." She stood beside the stagecoach, one hand gripping a leather traveling bag while the other pointed firmly at a burly miner who had apparently offered assistance she did not want. Her dark hair was pinned up beneath a practical bonnet, and her dress, though dusty from travel, was well made. What caught Daniel's attention was not just her appearance, but the way she held herself with confidence that seemed out of place in a rough mining town where most women either clung to their husbands or kept their eyes down. The miner laughed, reaching for her bag again. "Now come on, lady. I am just trying to help." Daniel crossed the street in a few long strides, his badge catching the afternoon sun. "The lady declined your offer. Move along." The miner sized him up, then shrugged and wandered off toward the nearest saloon. Daniel touched the brim of his hat to the woman, intending to walk away immediately, but she spoke before he could. "Thank you, Marshal. I appreciate the intervention, though I was managing." Her eyes were hazel, he noticed, with flecks of gold that seemed to catch the light. She looked to be in her mid-20s, and there was intelligence in her gaze that made him feel suddenly self-conscious about the trail dust on his own clothes. "Deputy Marshal," he corrected automatically. "Daniel Garrett, welcome to Leadville. Deanna Hollister." She shifted her bag to extend her hand, which surprised him. Most women waited for a formal introduction through mutual acquaintances. Her handshake was firm, businesslike. "I am looking for the boarding house run by Mrs. Patterson. I was told it is respectable and clean." "2 streets over, white building with green shutters. I can show you if you need." "Directions will suffice, thank you." He pointed out the route, and she thanked him again before heading off without a backward glance. Daniel stood there longer than necessary, watching her navigate the muddy street with practiced care, stepping around puddles left by the previous night's rain. Something about her presence had created a small crack in the walls he had built, and he did not quite know what to make of that feeling. Over the next week, he found himself noticing Deanna Hollister in ways that made him uncomfortable. She had come to Leadville to open a bookshop, of all things, in a town where most men could barely write their own names and spent their money on whiskey and cards. She had rented a small storefront near the assay office and spent her days unpacking crates of books, arranging them on shelves she had hired a carpenter to build. Daniel learned these details not through deliberate inquiry, but through the natural gossip that flowed through a frontier town like water through a sieve. Mrs. Patterson, the boarding house proprietress who also happened to be the widow of a former marshal, mentioned it when she brought him a basket of bread one evening. She had taken to checking on him periodically since his partner had died, worried that he was not eating properly. "That Miss Hollister is quite something," she said, setting the basket on his small kitchen table. "Well educated from Boston originally, her father was a professor, Can you imagine coming all the way out here to sell books? Takes all kinds, Daniel said, though he was more interested than he wanted to admit. She is not running from anything, if that is what you are thinking. She told me straight out that she wanted an adventure and a chance to build something of her own. Said back east, a woman can only do so much before society boxes her in. I think she is brave. Daniel did not respond, but later that night, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling beams, he thought about bravery. He had worn a badge for 10 years, faced down armed men in dangerous situations, but somehow the idea of walking into that bookshop and having a simple conversation with Deanna Hollister felt like it required more courage than he could muster. The problem was Jacob. His former partner had been more than just a colleague. They had worked together for 4 years, saved each other's lives more times than Daniel could count, and become as close as brothers. When Jacob had taken that bullet, meant for Daniel during a shootout with claim jumpers in the mountains outside town, Daniel had held him while he died. Jacob's last words still haunted him. "Do not do this alone, Danny. Promise me you will not shut yourself away." But Daniel had done exactly that. He had attended the funeral, helped Jacob's widow move back east to live with her family, and then retreated into himself so completely that he barely recognized the man he had become. Work became everything. He took shifts no one else wanted, volunteered for dangerous assignments, and spent his free time maintaining weapons or patrolling streets that did not need patrolling. Anything to avoid the silence that reminded him of all he had lost. The crack Diana had created in his walls bothered him because it suggested that the fortress he had built might not be as impenetrable as he had believed. Worse, part of him wanted to let her in, and that terrified him more than any outlaw he had ever faced. Saturday morning brought him into contact with her again, though not by design. A disturbance at the general store required his attention, just a minor dispute over prices that he resolved quickly. As he stepped back onto the boardwalk, Deanna emerged from the store next door, carrying a bundle wrapped in brown paper. "Deputy Garrett," she said, nodding in greeting. "Miss Hollister, how is the bookshop coming along?" Slowly. Apparently convincing minors that reading might be a worthwhile pursuit is more challenging than I anticipated. Her tone was wry, self-deprecating. "Though I did make my first sale yesterday. A gentleman bought a collection of Shakespeare sonnets in Leadville." Daniel could not keep the surprise from his voice. I was equally shocked. He said they were for his daughter back in St. Louis. He is saving money to bring her out here. She paused, studying his face with that direct gaze. "You look skeptical." "Just surprised. Most men around here spend their wages on less literary pursuits." "Well, I intend to change that, one book at a time." She smiled then, and it transformed her entire face, bringing warmth that made Daniel's chest tighten unexpectedly. "Though I may need to stock more practical volumes. Farming manuals, mining guides, that sort of thing." They stood there in awkward silence for a moment, and Daniel searched his mind for something intelligent to say. He came up empty, as usual when it came to social situations that did not involve enforcing the law. Diana rescued him. "I should get back. These are curtains for the shop windows. Mrs. Patterson helped me choose the fabric." "Right. Good day, then." He watched her walk away again, mentally cursing himself for his inability to maintain a simple conversation. What was wrong with him? He had not always been like this. Before Jacob died, he had been social enough, comfortable in town gatherings, even courted a schoolteacher briefly before she decided frontier life was not for her and returned to Philadelphia. That evening, Daniel sat on his porch with a cup of coffee and admitted something to himself. He was interested in Diana Hollister. More than interested. Something about her combination of determination and warmth drew him in despite his best efforts to maintain his isolation. The question was whether he had the courage to do anything about it. The answer came unexpectedly 2 days later, when he found himself responding to a break-in at her bookshop. Someone had smashed the front window during the night and scattered books across the floor. Diana stood in the middle of the chaos, her expression more angry than afraid. "They did not even steal anything," she said when Daniel arrived. "Just destroyed for the sake of destruction." He surveyed the damage, noting the boot prints in the scattered pages, the overturned shelves. "You have any idea who might have done this?" "No. I have barely been here 2 weeks. I cannot imagine I have made enemies already." She bent to pick up a damaged volume, smoothing the crumpled pages with gentle fingers. "Though some of the miners have made comments about how a woman has no business running a shop, especially one selling books. They think I should be married and keeping house." Daniel's jaw tightened. He recognized the attitude, had heard similar comments himself. "That does not give anyone the right to vandalize your property. I will look into it. Thank you." She met his eyes and something passed between them, a connection he felt in his bones. "I appreciate you taking this seriously." "The previous marshal I spoke with before you arrived seemed to think I should expect this sort of thing and just accept it. Marshal Williams retired 3 months ago. I am in charge now, at least until they appoint someone permanent. And no, you should not have to accept it." He pulled out his notebook. "I will need to ask you some questions." They spent the next hour going through details. Diana made coffee on the small stove in her back room, and they sat among the scattered books while Daniel took notes. She told him about her journey from Boston, her decision to leave behind a comfortable but constrained life for the uncertainty of the frontier. "My father thought I was insane," she admitted, cradling her coffee cup. "He wanted me to marry a colleague of his, a perfectly nice man who would have given me a perfectly boring life. I wanted something more, something mine." "That takes courage," Daniel said, and meant it, or foolishness. "I am not sure which yet." She smiled that warm smile again. "What about you, deputy? How did you end up in Leadville?" The question caught him off guard. He was not accustomed to people asking about him, and his first instinct was to deflect with a brief, impersonal answer. But something about the way Diana looked at him, genuinely interested, made him want to be honest. "Followed the work," he said slowly. "Started as a deputy in Kansas, then moved around as opportunities came up. Ended up here 4 years ago. Do you like it? The work, I mean," did he? Once upon a time he would have said yes without hesitation. Now he was not sure. "It is what I know how to do." Diana tilted her head, studying him with an intensity that made him want to look away. "That is not the same as liking it." "No," he admitted. "I suppose it is not." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, and Daniel realized with some surprise that he felt more relaxed than he had in years. There was something about Diana's presence that quieted the constant noise in his head, the guilt and grief that usually accompanied his every thought. "I should finish my investigation," he said finally, standing up. "I will let you know what I find out." "Thank you, Daniel." The use of his first name sent an unexpected warmth through him. "And thank you for the conversation. It gets lonely sometimes, being new in town." He understood loneliness better than she knew. "If you need anything, the marshal's office is just down the street." Over the following weeks, Daniel threw himself into investigating the vandalism with more dedication than the crime probably warranted. He questioned miners, checked with the saloon owners about who had been drinking heavily that night, followed leads that went nowhere. What he did not admit, even to himself at first, was that the investigation gave him an excuse to check on Diana regularly, to stop by the bookshop and ask questions that became less about the crime and more about her day, her progress with the store, her thoughts on Leadville. Deanna seemed to welcome his visits. She had made friends with Mrs. Patterson and a few other women in town, but Daniel sensed that she appreciated having someone to talk with about more than domestic concerns and town gossip. They discussed books, though his reading was limited compared to hers. They talked about the future of Leadville, whether the silver would last, or if the town would become another ghost settlement when the mines played out. They debated politics, religion, the nature of justice in a place where law was often whatever the men with guns said it was. One afternoon, nearly a month after the vandalism, Daniel finally caught the culprits. Two young miners, barely 20, who had been drunk and angry about losing money at cards. They had targeted Deanna's shop on a whim, thinking it represented everything wrong with Leadville becoming civilized. Daniel arrested them both and made sure they spent a few days in jail before paying for the damages and issuing a public apology. When he told Deanna the news, she surprised him by inviting him to dinner. "Nothing fancy," she said quickly, as if worried he might refuse. "Just a thank you for your persistence. Mrs. Patterson is letting me use her kitchen, and I promise I can cook better than the restaurants around here." Daniel's first instinct was to decline, to maintain the professional distance he had been carefully preserving. But something in her eyes, a hopeful vulnerability, made him nod instead. "That would be nice. Thank you." Dinner at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house turned out to be one of the best evenings Daniel had experienced in years. The older woman had tactfully made herself scarce, leaving Daniel and Deanna alone in the cozy dining room. Deanna had prepared roasted chicken with vegetables, and they ate by lamplight while rain pattered against the windows. "I miss this," Deanna said at one point, refilling his coffee. Conversation over a meal. "In Boston, we would have dinner parties at least once a week. My father loved debating with his colleagues while I listened and learned. I know it probably sounds boring to someone who has lived as much as you have, but I enjoyed those evenings." "It does not sound boring," Daniel said. "It sounds nice, civilized. Do you have family, Daniel? Anyone back east or elsewhere?" The question touched on territory he usually avoided, but with Deanna, the words came easier than expected. "Parents died of fever when I was young. I was raised by an uncle who ran a cattle ranch in Texas. He passed on 5 years ago. No siblings. No wife or children." He paused, then added, "There was someone once, but she decided frontier life was not for her. I am sorry. Do not be. We were not well suited anyway. She wanted me to give up law work, settle down in a city somewhere. That was not something I could do." He met Deanna's gaze across the table. "What I do, who I am, it matters. Out here, law is the only thing standing between civilization and chaos." "I understand that," Deanna said softly. "And I admire it. But do not you ever want something more? A home, a family?" The question hit closer than she probably realized. "I did once. Before." "Before what?" Daniel set down his coffee cup, the porcelain clicking against the saucer. He had not talked about Jacob to anyone since the funeral. Even thinking about it brought the familiar weight to his chest, the guilt that never quite left him. But Deanna waited with patient understanding in her eyes, and somehow the words started coming. "I had a partner. Jacob Matthews. We worked together for 4 years, became close friends. He had a wife, Sarah, and they were trying to start a family. 2 years ago, we went after some claim jumpers up in the mountains. There was a shootout, and Jacob took a bullet meant for me. He died in my arms." Deanna reached across the table and placed her hand over his. The simple gesture of comfort nearly undid him. "It was my fault," Daniel continued, his voice rough. "I should have seen the second gunman, should have been more careful. Jacob would still be alive if not for me." "You do not know that," Deanna said gently. From what you have told me, he chose to be there with you. He knew the risks. Knowing the risks does not make it easier to live with. I promised him I would not shut myself away, but that is exactly what I did. Threw myself into work, cut off everyone who tried to get close. It seemed safer that way, easier. Lonelier, though. Yes, he admitted. Lonelier. They sat in silence for a long moment, Deanna's hand still covering his. Finally, she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. I understand loneliness, Daniel. Different circumstances, but I know what it feels like to build walls around yourself. Back in Boston, I was always the professor's daughter, always expected to be a certain way, fit into a certain mold. I had friends, but I never felt like anyone really saw me, the real me underneath all the expectations. That is why I came here. I wanted to find out who I could be when no one had preconceived notions. And have you? Found out, I mean, she smiled. I am working on it. Opening the bookshop is part of that. And meeting people who see me as Deanna, not as an extension of my family or social position. People like you. Something shifted in that moment, a mutual recognition of kindred spirits who had both been carrying burdens alone. Daniel turned his hand over and clasped hers properly, feeling the warmth of her skin against his calloused palm. I am glad you came to Leadville, he said, meaning it more than he had meant anything in a long time. So am I, Deanna replied, her hazel eyes bright in the lamplight. From that evening forward, their relationship changed. Daniel found himself stopping by the bookshop not just occasionally, but daily, often bringing Deanna lunch from the cafe or helping her move heavy crates of new inventory. She invited him to dinner regularly, and they fell into a comfortable routine that felt dangerously close to courtship, though neither of them had explicitly acknowledged it as such. The town noticed, of course. Mrs. Patterson made knowing comments about what a fine couple they made. The other deputies teased Daniel good-naturedly about his frequent visits to the bookshop. Even some of the miners who had been skeptical of Diana's business began warming to her, partly because Daniel's obvious regard for her lent her a certain legitimacy in their eyes. But Daniel still held back from making any declaration of his feelings. The fear that had governed him for 2 years remained strong, whispering that caring for someone meant risking devastating loss. Every time he thought about telling Deanna how he felt, he remembered Jacob bleeding out in the dirt, remembered the crushing weight of grief that had followed. Deanna seemed to sense his hesitation and did not push, but Daniel could see questions in her eyes sometimes, a wondering about where they stood and where they might be headed. He wanted to give her answers, wanted to be brave enough to reach for the happiness that seemed within grasp, but fear kept him frozen. The turning point came on a crisp autumn evening in October. Daniel had just finished his rounds and was walking back to the office when he heard shouting from near the Silver Dollar Saloon. He hurried over to find a crowd gathered around 2 men fighting in the street. As he pushed through to break it up, he recognized one of the fighters as Tom Hendricks, a troublemaker who had been in and out of jail 3 times in the past 6 months. "Break it up," Daniel shouted, grabbing Tom by the collar and hauling him backward. Tom, drunk and belligerent, swung wildly. His fist caught Daniel across the jaw, snapping his head back. Training took over, and Daniel had Tom disarmed and subdued within seconds, but not before taking another hit to his ribs that would definitely bruise. He hauled Tom to jail, locked him up to sleep off the alcohol, and was heading home when Deanna appeared at his elbow, her face pale with concern. "I heard there was a fight. Are you hurt?" "I am fine," Daniel said automatically, then winced as the movement of speaking made his jaw ache. "You are not fine. Come to my shop. I have medical supplies there." "Deanna, really it is nothing. Daniel Garrett, do not make me drag you there by force. You are bleeding, and I am not letting you go home without at least cleaning those cuts." He gave in, too tired to argue. In the back room of her bookshop, Deanna cleaned the scrapes on his knuckles and the cut on his cheekbone with gentle efficiency. She worked in focused silence, her brow furrowed in concentration. "You could have been seriously hurt," she said finally, her voice tight with an emotion he could not quite identify. "It is part of the job. That does not make it acceptable." She set down the cloth she had been using and looked at him directly. "Daniel, I need to know something. What is this between us? Because I find myself caring very much whether you get hurt, and that frightens me because I do not know if you feel the same way." The moment of truth had arrived, and Daniel felt panic rising in his chest. But as he looked at Deanna, at the vulnerability and courage in her expression, he realized that he was more afraid of losing her than he was of admitting his feelings. "I care," he said, his voice rough. "More than I have cared about anyone in a long time. You terrify me, Deanna Hollister, because when I am with you, I start thinking about futures and possibilities instead of just getting through each day. You make me want things I thought I had given up on." "What kind of things?" "A home. A family. Someone to share my life with instead of just enduring it alone." He reached up and cupped her face gently, mindful of his bruised knuckles. "But I am afraid that if I let myself love you, something will happen. That I will lose you like I lost Jacob, and I do not know if I could survive that." Deanna covered his hand with hers, leaning into his touch. "I am afraid too. Afraid that I have built up this life here, found my independence, and now I am risking it all by falling in love with a man whose job puts him in danger regularly. But you know what I have learned. Fear is not a good enough reason to deny ourselves happiness. You are falling in love with me?" Daniel asked, needing to hear it clearly. "I already have fallen," Deanna said simply. "I love you, Daniel. I love your dedication and your kindness and the way you see me as a complete person, not just a woman who needs protecting or controlling. I love how seriously you take your responsibilities and how you are trying so hard to heal from your past. I love you, and I am choosing to be brave enough to tell you so." Something broke open in Daniel's chest, all the walls he had built crumbling in the face of her honesty. He pulled her close and kissed her, pouring 2 years of loneliness and longing into that connection. Deanna responded with equal fervor, her arms wrapping around his neck as if she would never let go. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Daniel rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said, the words feeling both foreign and right. "I have been falling in love with you since the day you arrived in Leadville and told that miner to keep his hands to himself. You are the bravest person I know, and you make me want to be brave too." Deanna laughed, the sound bright with joy. "So what do we do now?" "Now," Daniel pulled back enough to look at her properly. "Now I court you properly. Take you to dinner, to church socials, whatever respectable activities Leadville has to offer. And then, if you will have me, I marry you and spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing this particular lawman." "That sounds perfect," Deanna said, smiling up at him. "Though I should warn you, I have no intention of giving up my bookshop. Wife or not, I still want my independence. I would not dream of asking you to give it up. Your shop is part of who you are, and I love all of who you are." They sealed the promise with another kiss, and for the first time in years, Daniel felt something other than grief and guilt when he thought about the future. He felt hope. The courtship that followed was everything Daniel had promised and more. Despite the rough and tumble nature of Leadville, they found ways to make their relationship special. Daniel took Deanna on picnics in the mountains, showing her the beautiful country surrounding the mining town. She introduced him to literature he had never considered reading, and they spent evenings taking turns reading aloud to each other by lamplight. The town embraced their romance with enthusiasm. Mrs. Patterson became a self-appointed chaperone and champion, making sure everything was done properly while also giving them enough privacy to deepen their connection. The other deputies covered for Daniel when he wanted to spend time with Deanna, teasing him mercilessly but clearly happy to see him opening up again. 3 months after their first kiss, on a cold January evening in 1883, Daniel proposed. He did it simply, without elaborate planning, because the moment felt right. They were in Diana's bookshop after closing, and she was showing him a new shipment of books that had arrived from Denver. "Deanna," he said, interrupting her enthusiastic description of a collection of poetry. "Marry me." She stopped mid-sentence, her eyes widening. "What?" Daniel got down on one knee there among the stacks of books that smelled of paper and possibility. "I know we have not been courting long by conventional standards, but I have never been more certain of anything. Marry me. Build a life with me here in Leadville. Let me love you for the rest of our days." He pulled out a simple gold band he had purchased from the jeweler that afternoon. It was not elaborate, but it was honest, like everything between them. Diana's eyes filled with tears. "Yes, yes, absolutely yes." She pulled him to his feet and kissed him, and Daniel felt the last of his fear finally release its hold. He was not betraying Jacob's memory by choosing to love again. In fact, he was honoring it by keeping the promise he had made, to not shut himself away from life. They married in March, in the small church at the edge of Leadville, with most of the town in attendance. Mrs. Patterson cried through the entire ceremony, and even some of the gruff miners who attended looked suspiciously misty-eyed. Deanna wore a simple cream-colored dress she had ordered from Denver, and Daniel wore his best suit, his badge pinned over his heart. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Daniel kissed his bride and felt complete in a way he had not felt since before Jacob died. Deanna smiled up at him, radiant with happiness, and whispered, "I love you, Deputy Marshal Garrett." "I love you too, Mrs. Garrett." They moved into a small house on the outskirts of town, big enough for the family they both hoped to have someday. Deanna kept running her bookshop, which had slowly but steadily become a fixture of Leadville's community. She started a lending library and began teaching reading classes twice a week for anyone who wanted to learn, including many of the miners who had initially scoffed at the idea of a bookshop. Daniel continued his work as deputy marshal, but the job no longer consumed his entire existence. He came home to Diana each evening, and they built a life together filled with simple pleasures, shared meals, quiet conversations, making plans for the future. The darkness that had shadowed him for so long receded in the light of their partnership. Their first year of marriage brought challenges, as all first years do. They learned each other's habits and quirks, navigated disagreements about everything from household finances to whether Daniel's job was too dangerous. Deanna hated the nights when he came home hurt, and they had more than one serious conversation about whether he should consider different work. But Daniel could not imagine doing anything else, and Deanna eventually accepted that law enforcement was not just his job but his calling. In return, he supported her ambitions for the bookshop, even helping her expand into the empty store next door when the milliner moved to Denver. In the summer of 1884, Diana discovered she was pregnant. The news filled them both with joy and trepidation. Daniel worried about being a good father, about whether he could balance the demands of his job with the needs of a family. Diana worried about the dangers of childbirth in a frontier town where medical care was limited. But they faced these fears together, supporting each other through the uncertainties. Daniel became even more protective, which Deanna tolerated with patient amusement. He accompanied her to every appointment with the local doctor, asked endless questions about what she should and should not be doing, and generally fretted more than she did. "The baby is not due for months," Deanna reminded him one evening when he insisted she should not be lifting boxes at the shop. "I am pregnant, not fragile." I know. I just want to make sure you are both safe." Deanna took his face in her hands and kissed him gently. "We are safe, Daniel. And we are going to be fine. You are going to be an amazing father." "You think so? I know so. You are the most dedicated, caring man I have ever known. Our child is lucky to have you." Their son was born on a freezing February morning in 1885. The labor was long and difficult, and Daniel spent most of it pacing outside the bedroom where Mrs. Patterson and the doctor attended to Deanna. When he finally heard the baby's cry, he nearly collapsed with relief. The doctor emerged, tired but smiling. "You have a healthy son, Marshal. And your wife did wonderfully. You can go in now." Daniel entered the room to find Deanna propped up in bed, exhausted but glowing, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. She looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. "Daniel, meet your son." He approached slowly, almost afraid to touch something so small and precious. Deanna pulled back the blanket to reveal a red-faced infant with a surprising amount of dark hair. The baby's eyes were closed, but his tiny fist waved in the air as if already prepared to fight the world. "He is perfect," Daniel breathed, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed. "You are perfect. Do you want to hold him?" Daniel had handled guns and outlaws, faced down dangerous men without flinching, but the prospect of holding his newborn son terrified him more than any of that. Still, he carefully took the baby from Deanna, cradling the warm weight against his chest. The infant settled immediately, making small snuffling sounds. Daniel looked down at his son's face and felt love slam into him with the force of a physical blow. This tiny person was part of him and Deanna, a symbol of their love and their future. "What should we name him?" Deanna asked softly. They had discussed names for months without settling on anything. But now, holding his son, Daniel knew exactly what felt right. "Jacob," he said, meeting Deanna's eyes. "Jacob Daniel Garrett, if that is all right with you." Diana's expression softened with understanding. "It is more than all right, it is perfect." Naming their son after his lost partner felt like completing a circle, honoring the past while embracing the future. Daniel thought about how Jacob had made him promise not to shut himself away. And here he was, holding his son, married to the woman he loved, more connected to life than he had ever thought possible after that terrible day in the mountains. Little Jacob proved to be a healthy, if demanding, baby. He had his mother's hazel eyes and his father's stubborn determination. Daniel took to fatherhood with the same dedication he brought to everything, though the sleepless nights tested even his patience. Deanna managed motherhood and the bookshop with remarkable grace, though she did hire a young woman named Sarah Mitchell to help with the store. They worked out a system where Deanna could bring Jacob to the shop when needed, and the whole arrangement became a symbol of how Leadville itself was evolving from a rough mining camp into a real community. As Jacob grew from infant to toddler, Daniel watched with wonder as his son's personality emerged. The boy was curious about everything, already showing signs of his mother's intelligence and his father's protective instincts. He loved when Daniel carried him through town on his shoulders, pointing at everything and asking endless questions in his limited vocabulary. On Jacob's second birthday, Diana surprised Daniel with news that she was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because they knew what to expect. Their daughter Emma was born in the autumn of 1887, arriving with less drama than her brother but just as much love. Emma had Deanna's dark hair and Daniel's gray eyes, and from the start, she seemed to have both parents wrapped around her tiny finger. Jacob, now a rambunctious 3-year-old, was fascinated by his baby sister and wanted to help with everything. "Gentle," Daniel reminded him constantly as Jacob tried to pat Emma's head with more enthusiasm than coordination. "She is still very small." "I be careful, Papa," Jacob assured him, using the careful whisper they had taught him for when the baby was sleeping. Life settled into a beautiful rhythm. Daniel had been promoted to Marshal after his predecessor retired, which came with more responsibility but also more stability. He had a deputy of his own now, a young man named Thomas Reed who reminded Daniel of himself at that age, eager and dedicated. Deanna's bookshop had become a cornerstone of the community. She had started a book club that met monthly, and her lending library was used by people from all walks of life. She had proven that even in a mining town, there was hunger for culture and learning. But more than any of their individual successes, what mattered most was what they had built together. The lonely deputy marshal and the independent bookshop owner had found in each other exactly what they needed. They had created a home filled with love and laughter, had raised children who knew they were cherished, had become part of a community they both served and shaped. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Daniel and Diana arranged for Mrs. Patterson to watch the children so they could have an evening alone. They went to dinner at the nicest restaurant Leadville had to offer, and afterward they walked through town in the twilight. "You ever regret it?" Daniel asked, slipping his arm around Deanna's waist. "Leaving Boston, coming out here, tying yourself to a lawman in a rough mining town," Deanna laughed. "Not for a single moment. Do you regret opening yourself up to love again?" "Never," Daniel said firmly. "You saved me, Deanna. I was drowning in grief and loneliness and you pulled me back to life." "We saved each other," Deanna corrected, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I was lost too, just in a different way. We found each other exactly when we needed to." They stopped walking and stood looking up at the mountains surrounding Leadville, peaks turning purple in the fading light. Daniel thought about the journey that had brought him here, all the pain and loss that had seemed insurmountable. He thought about Jacob Matthews and the promise he had made. He had kept that promise, had built a life full of connection and meaning. "I love you," he said to Deanna, the words still carrying weight even after 5 years of marriage. "Thank you for walking into my life and refusing to let me stay locked away." "I love you too," Deanna replied, tilting her face up for a kiss. "Thank you for being brave enough to let me in." The years continued to pass, bringing the changes that always come with time. Leadville evolved as the silver deposits began to thin, though the town never became the ghost settlement some had predicted. Daniel and Diana became pillars of the community, respected and valued for their contributions. Jacob grew into a thoughtful boy who loved books like his mother and had his father's sense of justice. He often said he wanted to be a marshal like Papa when he grew up, which filled Daniel with both pride and worry. Emma was more artistic, spending hours drawing and painting, showing talent that neither parent quite understood but both encouraged. In 1890, Diana gave birth to their 3rd child, another son they named William. He was a happy, easy baby who seemed content just to observe the world around him. With 3 children now, the house felt wonderfully chaotic, full of the noise and energy that comes with a young family. Daniel, now 40 years old, found himself thinking often about how different his life could have been. If Deanna had not come to Leadville, if he had not found the courage to open his heart again, he would still be that lonely deputy going through the motions of living without really being alive. One evening, after getting all 3 children to bed, Daniel and Deanna collapsed on the porch swing, exhausted but content. "Remind me why we thought having 3 children was a good idea," Deanna joked, resting her head on Daniel's shoulder. "Because we are both slightly insane," Daniel suggested, wrapping his arm around her. "That must be it." Deanna was quiet for a moment, then said, "Daniel, do you ever think about the future? About what happens when the children are grown and we are old?" "Sometimes." "Why?" "I have been thinking about expanding the bookshop again. Maybe opening a second location in Denver, or even starting a publishing company to help frontier writers get their work into print. But then I wonder if I am being foolish, if I should just be content with what we have." Daniel turned to look at her properly. "Deanna, one of the things I love most about you is your ambition, your refusal to be limited by what anyone else thinks you should do. If you want to expand the business, I support you completely. We will figure out how to make it work. Even if it means I am traveling more, spending time in Denver, even then. I trust you and I believe in your vision. Besides, the children are getting older. Jacob starts school next year. You should pursue your dreams." Deanna kissed him, a long, slow kiss that still had the power to make his heart race even after years of marriage. "Have I mentioned lately how much I love you?" "Not in at least an hour," Daniel teased. "I was starting to worry." They sat on the porch until the stars came out, making plans and dreaming about the future in the way they had always done together. It was this partnership, this mutual support and genuine friendship underlying their romantic love that had made their marriage so strong. Deanna did expand her business, opening a second bookshop in Denver and starting a small publishing company that specialized in books about the American West. She traveled regularly but always came home to Leadville, to Daniel and the children who were the center of her world. Daniel continued as marshal, training deputies and maintaining order in a town that was slowly but surely becoming more civilized. He had his share of dangerous moments over the years, but he always came home to Deanna, always kept the promise he had made to her on their wedding day. Their children thrived. Jacob did eventually become a lawman, following in his father's footsteps despite Daniel's initial reservations. Emma became an artist, studying in Denver and eventually New York, though she always returned to Leadville for extended visits. William, the quiet observer, surprised everyone by becoming a lawyer, using his sharp mind and sense of justice in a different way than his father and brother. As Daniel reached his 50th birthday in 1900, he looked back on the past 18 years with deep satisfaction. He had gone from a lonely, grief-stricken man going through the motions to someone with a rich, full life surrounded by love. Deanna had given him that, but more than that, they had built it together. The 20th century brought changes to Leadville and to the Garrett family. The mining industry continued its slow decline, though the town adapted by diversifying its economy. Deanna's publishing company thrived, bringing attention to writers who might otherwise have been overlooked. Daniel eventually retired from active law enforcement, though he stayed on as a consultant and mentor to younger lawmen. Their golden anniversary in 1933 was celebrated by the entire town. Jacob, now a respected marshal himself with his own family, organized a party at the community hall. Emma came from New York with her husband and 2 children. William traveled from Denver, where he had established a successful law practice. Standing in the hall surrounded by children, grandchildren, friends, and community members, Daniel looked across the room at Deanna and marveled at how beautiful she still was to him. Her hair was silver now, and lines creased her face, but her eyes still sparkled with the same intelligence and warmth that had captured his heart 50 years ago. He crossed the room to her, took her hand, and led her to the center of the floor as the small orchestra began to play. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Garrett?" "You may, Marshal Garrett." They danced slowly, holding each other close while their family and friends looked on with affection. Daniel leaned down and whispered in Diana's ear, "Thank you." "For what?" "For everything. For coming to Leadville. For refusing to accept my loneliness. For loving me enough to break down my walls. For 50 years of partnership and love and adventure. For giving me a life I never imagined possible." Diana pulled back enough to look into his eyes, her own glistening with tears. "You gave me all of that too, you know. We chose each other and we chose to be brave together. That has made all the difference." "I love you," Daniel said, the words as true and necessary as they had been the first time he spoke them. "I love you too," Diana replied. "Today, tomorrow, and always." They continued dancing as the music played. Two people who had found each other against the odds and built something beautiful from the ashes of loneliness. Around them, their family and the community they had helped shape celebrated not just a marriage but the power of love to transform lives. Daniel thought about the young deputy marshal who had stood on the streets of Leadville all those years ago, wounded and walled off from the world. He thought about the courageous woman who had stepped off a stagecoach with nothing but determination and a dream. Separately, they had been incomplete. Together, they had become whole. As the evening wound down and they said goodbye to guests, Daniel and Diana walked home through the familiar streets of Leadville. The town had changed dramatically from the rough mining camp where they had met, but it was still home, still the place where their story had begun. They sat on their porch, the same porch where they had spent countless evenings over the decades, and looked up at the stars. No regrets. Diana asked, as she always did on their anniversaries. "Not a single one," Daniel replied, as he always did. "You. Only that I did not find you sooner." Daniel pulled her close, grateful beyond words for the woman who had walked into his life and filled the emptiness. He had been lonely for years, convinced that isolation was safer than connection, that walls were better than vulnerability. Diana had proven him wrong in the best possible way. Their story was not one of grand adventures or dramatic gestures. It was quieter than that, but no less profound. It was the story of two people who found each other, chose each other, and built a life based on love, respect, and genuine partnership. It was the story of loneliness transformed into belonging, of fear overcome by courage, of walls torn down and hearts opened. As they sat together in the darkness, Daniel reflected on the promise he had made to Jacob Matthews so many years ago to not shut himself away from life. He had kept that promise, and in doing so, had found more happiness than he had ever thought possible. "What are you thinking about?" Diana asked, sensing his contemplative mood. "About how grateful I am, about how one moment can change everything, about how you stepping off that stagecoach was the best thing that ever happened to me." Diana smiled and squeezed his hand. "Fate brought us together, but we chose to stay." "That is what matters." Daniel agreed. They had chosen each other every day for 50 years, through good times and challenges, through the ordinary moments and the extraordinary ones. That daily choice, that commitment to love and partnership, had been the foundation of everything beautiful in his life. The stars wheeled overhead, the same stars that had watched them dance on their wedding day, that had seen them bring their children home from the hospital, that had witnessed every triumph and struggle of their 5 decades together. And beneath those stars, Daniel and Diana Garrett sat hand in hand, two hearts that had found their home in each other, two souls that had transformed loneliness into the deepest kind of love. Their children were grown and successful. Their grandchildren were starting their own adventures. The bookshop and publishing company Diana had built continued to thrive. The town they had helped civilize was prosperous and peaceful. But more than any of those external successes, what truly mattered was the life they had created together, the love they had nurtured, the family they had raised. As the night deepened, they finally went inside to the home they had shared for so many years, a home filled with memories and love. In their bedroom, Daniel helped Deanna with the buttons on her dress, a ritual so familiar it required no thought. "I meant what I said earlier," he told her as they prepared for bed. "Thank you for everything." "You have thanked me at least a dozen times today," Deanna said with gentle amusement. "I will probably thank you a dozen more tomorrow. I never want to take for granted what we have." They settled into bed, and Deanna curled against Daniel's side the way she had done for 50 years. He wrapped his arm around her, holding her close, and thought about the journey that had brought them here. He had been so broken when they met, so convinced that love meant inevitable loss. Deanna had taught him that while loss was indeed part of life, so was love, and the love was worth the risk. She had shown him that opening his heart did not make him weak, but made him stronger. Together, they had built something that had sustained them through everything life threw their way. "Daniel," Deanna's voice was sleepy. "Are you happy?" "Happier than I ever thought possible," he answered honestly. "You completely and utterly happy. Good night, my love. Good night, Deanna." They drifted off to sleep in each other's arms, two people who had found everything they needed in each other. Outside, Leadville slept under the Colorado stars, a testament to the endurance of love and the power of two people brave enough to tear down their walls and build something beautiful together. Daniel's last thought before sleep claimed him was that he had kept his promise to Jacob in the most profound way possible. He had not shut himself away. He had lived fully, loved deeply, and created a legacy that would outlast him. And it had all started with a lonely deputy marshal and a courageous woman who refused to accept his isolation. She had walked into his life and filled the emptiness, and in return, he had given her a partner worthy of her courage and ambition. Together, they had created something extraordinary from the simple choice to be brave enough to love. And that, Daniel thought as sleep finally took him, was the greatest adventure of all.